what is hybrid publishing?
It's a model that means that authors are going to maintain a lot more control over their publishing experience, get a larger percentage of royalties. With Atmosphere, you get 90% of your royalties.
Are you open to disclosing kind of roughly what an investment would be to work with a hybrid publisher for an author?
Yeah, it varies a good bit. Different places sort of run at different price points and sort of run in different crowds. I think for Atmosphere, we're, very, competitive on the pricing side of things. And we sort of see our primary differentiator in just offering people more for the amount of investment that it is. So it ranges between and.
You are listening to My Rejection Story, hosted by Alice Draper. Can you tell me about a time in your life when you felt rejected?
Yeah. I think thanks for having me, first off. And it's interesting because, as you mentioned, I used to be a college professor, and I'm an author as well. And now it just so happens that I'm running this publishing company, and rejection is a huge part of how I sort of ended up in that world, right? So being an author, of course, getting rejected a lot, but then also rejection in my academic career. So actually the thing that led me to sort of go all in on the Atmosphere Press experience and trying to help authors was getting laid off from a teaching job. And I often think back on that experience, walking in to a room where HR was, and they were laying off a bunch of people, and my head was on the chopping block. And, I had high hopes for this career, right, for a long time. And now I look back on that and am just so grateful for that rejection, like being sort of, cast out of the ivory tower due to circumstance and all sorts of other things, just it's a difficult industry and all of that sort of gave me no choice but to pursue something different. And now that something different has led to a much better life for myself, and obviously some pretty good opportunities for a whole bunch of authors as well.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. The cliched quote, rejection is redirection. It's so, I think when in retrospect, I think you can look at this now and so clearly see that you're glad that it happened and it redirected you. But I think it's the kind of quote that annoys people or offends people in the moment, because like I can imagine when you're in the thick of it and you've just been laid off from this job and someone's saying like, oh, you're being redirected towards something better. It's kind of like being in the thick of a breakup and someone's like, don't worry, there's other fish in the sea, and you're like, shut up, like this sucks. So this leads to my next question, which is I'm curious to kind of know, what were you feeling and thinking and going through in the moment that you got laid off? Did this idea come to you immediately? Like what was that process like?
Yeah, so it was, obviously I was just really stunned, like this was a teaching job where they had sort of primed me to be, a long-term tenured professor there. And I, sort of pursued that and took steps in my career to, try to facilitate that. But then it was just broader economic forces sort of dictated that was impossible. So I was really shocked because I thought I was sort of a golden boy and like I had really good reviews and stuff like that. And I was like, oh, this is finally like working out in academia after years of frustration. And then, so I was very shocked and upset at the time. And in terms of redirecting to something different, my first thing was like, I just needed to get more teaching gigs elsewhere. I needed to keep trying to stay in this. And I'd founded Atmosphere a couple years earlier, but it was just kind of a side gig. It was a side hustle where some authors would say, I was helping them as a writing coach, and they would want help publishing their book. And I'd say, okay, sure, let's do that. This is what it'll take to make that happen. And I can, get your book out there and publish it with this little small press. But then when getting laid off, it was like well, now I need money. I had 2 kids, I was a single dad. I was like trying to, figure out how to patch a life together. So all of a sudden I was sort of forced to think more entrepreneurially, which was never in my background. I didn't have any sort of business background. So all of a sudden I had to be like, how do I get clients? Like, how does that happen? Like, how do I find authors? How do I find people who want to go through this process? So, desperation, or as they say,
Yeah.
necessity is the mother of all invention. I think desperation also is part of that necessity.
Yeah, I actually said to my partner once, I think I lost like two clients at once. I lost because usually I would never lose more than one client at once, but it was just like complete coincidence that a client's contract ended and then another client like had to part ways. And I said to him like, "There's something very motivating about losing clients. Like I feel like I do my best work when I feel a little bit of like, oh my god, like are things on fire?" So I very much resonate with the note on desperation.
Yeah,
So
and I
tell me a
think
little
it's
bit.
I think it's great, like it is difficult when you're in that moment, but I always think also of that that Hindu symbol, the Nataraj, the dancing Shiva,
Yeah, yeah,
where it's, things are being created as they're being destroyed. And that's the sort of the cosmic dance, right? And that
yeah,
anytime something is sort of being torn to pieces, that's where new opportunity is going to arise. But obviously, like if your house is burning down, you're not going to be able to think about how much more you're going to love your new house, right?
were there moments of self-doubt or points where you even were rejected, whether it was outwardly or kind of in your head, and you questioned whether you could do this?
Oh, of course, like
Yeah.
every day, you know. Yeah. There's still a lot because a big thing is I was just an academic, like I
Mm,
was a poet. I have a MFA in creative writing. I have a PhD in literary analysis with a poetry
yeah.
focus, right? Like, what do I know about running a business, right? So there was a lot of imposter syndrome, going in, a lot of, feeling, insecure about it. And, if you have like one bad week, I used to just freak out, like it
Yeah.
was really, really scary. Now, if I have a bad week, I'll be like, I've had these before,
Mm,
but, having dealing with those issues. And obviously, as a hybrid press, you know, when I started this back in 2015, like nobody even knew what a hybrid press was,
mm,
so, and we weren't even using that term. It wasn't even known enough at that point for me to even know it. I just knew that we were going to be a service-based publisher and that we would be really transparent about how we did things. We were going to be honest about how we did things. So that was something that sort of guided us from the start. But because there were a lot of people who didn't like that model, they thought that traditional publishing was the only way to publish. There was a lot of rejection, a lot of people just not liking what we were doing, no matter how ethical we were, no matter whether we were donating to charity, whether we were trying to, no matter how great our testimonials were, there were still going to be haters out there,
yeah.
right? And we still deal with that. It's still something that we have to encounter and like work against. But
Mm,
now it's a lot better than it
yeah.
than it used to be, just because more people understand that this is a viable way to publish, and more of our authors are winning awards and selling a lot of books, and getting the type of respect that historically would have been reserved only for traditionally published authors.
Yeah, yeah. There's so many great things you touched on there. You One of the things that really stuck out was when you said one bad week meant like the end of the world in the beginning, whereas later on it's like, well, I've survived these before, and that's very much my philosophy with normalizing something like rejections. Is I think exposure therapy works in this context. We habituate, and in the beginning, it's going to sting, it's going to hurt. It's like getting into a really, really cold pool, and over time, it starts to feel less and less cold, less stings less and hurts less. But yeah, and then the other kind of part being, putting yourself out there as you're going to have haters, and I think that that's a part of anything, is not everyone's going to like what we're doing, and that doesn't mean that we shouldn't keep moving forward. The next question I want to ask is, I think that as much as people are more educated on what it means to be a hybrid publisher, not everyone still knows what it means. My mom doesn't know. I had to explain it to her like a few times. So for any listeners who don't know what it means to work with a hybrid publisher for their book, what is hybrid publishing?
Yeah, so basically, it's a model that, for the most part, means that authors are going to maintain a lot more control over their publishing experience rather than trying to go through an agent, getting rejected a bajillion times by agents or by traditional publishers. You're going to have a lot more, control over the process. You're going to get a larger percentage of royalties. With Atmosphere, you get 90% of your royalties. You're going to maintain the rights to your book, so you don't have to worry about somebody taking the rights to your book or, anything that's based on your book. You're going to get a lot more say over aesthetic decisions, things like this. Sort of to make this happen, of course, you need to invest in the project. Right.
Mm.
So it is a model that requires an investment from the author. And that's where sometimes people are like, oh, I don't like that part. And it's like, well, it's sort of the same as any other industry. It's like you sort of get what you pay for. And even with the traditional press, you're going to get what you pay for. If it's a really like small place, you're not going to pay anything, but you're also not really going to get very much out of it.
Yeah.
Right. And with a traditional press, you might ultimately, at the end of the day, even if you have a bestseller, you're going to be paying them a lot of money on the back end of the project. But since we're in other reputable hybrid presses are, based on an ethics forward, a transparent model, like our contract is available on our website. You just go to our website, there's the contract. Like no other publishers that I know of have a contract that they just make publicly available. And that's where you sort of see exactly how it's all done. You see all the services that are being provided. It's not, vanity publishing where we're just cranking stuff out. We're still selective in what we work with, but we're very clear about the editorial meetings that you get, the involvement that you're going to have in cover design, the number of cover designs that you're going to be seeing and being able to choose from and work with designers on, getting publicity on your book, helping you get reviews, doing paid advertising for your book, sort of acting as your advocate through the duration of the entire process.
That was such a great snapshot. So I'm a podcast publicist, and a couple of my clients have gone the hybrid route, and I've seen, like, I guess you say secondhand, not firsthand. I wasn't the one writing the book. Kind of all the benefits, and a lot of my clients had actually opted. Like some of them had really, really big platforms, and they opted out of the traditional route because of various factors, some being the timeline, because it takes years to get your book out into the world, whereas with hybrid, you can have a lot more control over the timeline. And as you mentioned, the royalties being a big one. Are you open to disclosing kind of roughly what an investment would be to work with a hybrid publisher for an author?
Yeah, it varies a good bit. Different places sort of run at different price points and sort of run in different crowds. I think for Atmosphere, we're, very, competitive on the pricing side of things. And we sort of see our primary differentiator in just offering people more for the amount of investment that it is. So it ranges between 5,700 and 11,700 US. That's sort of where our, sort of range, runs. But the amount of stuff that you get for that between editorial meetings and cover design and, the amount of publicity that we do for our authors and the distribution and all of that, it's definitely a lot of stuff that we're authors. And, the big thing is that what we really think a lot about is that we don't really want to be a big publisher. We want to be a better publisher, that we want people to feel, really like valued in the experience. Because historically in publishing, the whole industry is rejection based, right?
I know. Actually, like, one of my questions was like, no matter what route you go, there's going to be rejections.
Yeah, anyway. It's brutal. I mean, I was looking at my, because I'm also a writer myself, and looking at, my literary journal submissions. I used to submit a lot to literary journals, and, I've been published in, I can say like, oh, I've been published in 100 literary literary journals. And then I go and I look at the record and see how many rejections. It's like, oh, it's way more than 10 times that many. Like I was getting rejected like all the time. It's crazy how much rejection is part of the publishing world. So we
Yeah.
know that like authors a lot of times are coming to us with battle scars,
Yeah.
from years of sort of having sand kicked on their face because of the sort of power imbalance between publishers or agents, and writers, where on the one side, these gatekeepers hold all the cards, and then the writers, no matter how talented or dedicated they are sort of left groveling, to
Mm,
try to get
mm,
some love. So we as a press have just really wanted to, help authors, to listen to authors, to, make them feel validated, to match them up with an editor who's going to help them, accentuate their own vision rather than us try to distort it into our own vision,
yeah.
and let the authors decide which cover option they're going to move forward with rather than us trying to just say, oh, this is what marketing says is going to work. Now you're stuck with it,
Yeah.
So,
There's actually,
yeah.
sorry, there's an episode on this show with Gay Hendricks, who's quite a well-known author, and he talks about getting this great book deal, like a lot of money, and the editor he was working with ended up leaving, and he ended up getting people that didn't care about his book and did an awful cover. And he said like promoting that book felt like promoting something that you like have no connection to, you don't like it's just not something that, after putting all that work into writing that book, like grueling hours and hours, and because the traditional route, there runs a risk that you may not have control over what your product, being your book, looks like in the end. Sorry, so you can carry on.
Yeah, no, it's brutal. It's brutal.
Mm,
That happens a lot. And that's just like different layers of rejection, right? Like
yeah,
even if you get accepted, even if you get the golden ticket, then you're maybe having your ideas about your vision for the story rejected, by an editor who may or may not care about your work, or your vision for how it should look might be rejected. So, there's a lot of that going in, and we do, sort of try to counteract that atmosphere press.
yeah, yeah. And I think it's probably a balancing act, because at the same time, you want the book to work marketing wise, you want it to sell, you want it to perform. And I think part of that investment includes a lot of those components.
Mm-hmm.
What do you, because there's the self-publishing route where someone just goes and puts the book up on Amazon themselves. But what do they get? What kind of support do they get? Like marketing wise, I don't know if you can break it down into the nitty gritties of what they would be getting.
Yeah. So we do a lot of that. That was actually something that, we worked really hard just over the last like couple years, because we had all the nuts and bolts of like producing a book, going through the editorial and the design. Like we had that locked down like pretty
Mm,
well by like 2020, but the marketing part, we were still like, okay, let's try to figure this out. So now, we help get authors interviews, right? We help authors get reviews for their books. We even like guarantee them a certain number of reviews for their book. We'll try to, get them Kirkus stuff taken care of. We host readings with our authors, and really like a big part of what we do is, well, we do a lot of keyword analysis, to try to make sure that books are like listed properly, so
mm,
that they're going to get, organic traffic when possible. And then the biggest thing of all, I think, is just the author education. We
mm.
do consultations with authors. We give them a lot of guidance. We tell them like, okay, this is how this has worked in the past. These are some things that you can do right from when an author signs on with us. We're trying to help them, give them some coaching on building their mailing list. Stuff like that. I mean, self-publishing is great. Like a lot of authors are, have had wonderful experiences self-publishing, but a lot of people, need more guidance, like not just on producing a good book, but also in like knowing what next steps to take in terms of getting the word out.
Mm, mm. And do you help get the books into bookshops? Because I know that that's something that sometimes helps, like getting into Barnes and Nobles is very hard if you're just self-publishing.
Yeah, that's definitely something that, there are it's complicated,
Yeah.
right? Because a lot of times with bookstores, especially like big box stores, you're looking at like paying for shelf placement, things like that
Mm.
are difficult. So some of those things we've dallied in a little bit, but so a lot of them just don't seem to be really great value propositions for authors.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we do have our books stocked in a lot of independent bookstores because they tend to
Mm.
be more amenable, especially working with local authors and trying to help get books on shelves and get them like reading events in their local area,
Yeah.
and just do anything that you can to try to build yourself a little bit of a profile if that's what you want. Some
Yeah.
authors don't even care about that stuff. So and then by virtue of that, we don't twist their arms to try to
Mm.
make them you know want to get out there and hit the road and pound the pavement and sell books out of the trunks of their cars. Some authors are dying to do that stuff, and we help facilitate that, and other ones
Yeah.
are like, I'd rather just sit at home.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
cool too.
Yeah, yeah. I've seen some of the commitments like some of my clients have had to their publishers with promoting books, and like I don't know how anyone could fit that into their schedule. Like, um, but it is. I think it's one of the challenging things of writing a book is not just the writing process; it's the post-writing process and even pre-writing process. Because getting an audience, building an audience of readers for your book is perhaps one of the hardest things. And I think it's also worth mentioning, just from conversations I've had and stuff, that's something that is often in the minds of traditional publishing houses when they select authors is, do you have an audience of buyers to buy that book? If you have a giant mailing list and like huge social media platform, you are more likely to get a book deal. So that often goes against what writers spend their time doing, which is writing and not getting huge platforms. So those rejections are not necessarily about your writing; they're often about something much bigger than that.
Oh, absolutely. And that's, I think, one of the most ironic parts about traditional
Mm,
publishing now is that a lot of times it does have a huge bunch to do with what is your platform. Like, how many Instagram followers do you have? How many people are on your newsletter? How famous are you?
mm,
And that's a big thing that, is attractive to traditional publishers. But the irony there is that those are the exact kind of people who would benefit more
yeah,
from a hybrid publishing kind of deal, where they get to work with professionals like they would with a traditional place, but they just invest up front, and then they get so much more on the royalties return that they're going to end up like quadrupling the amount of actual like financial takeaway.
yeah,
Because if it's not the publisher's publicity apparatus that's selling the book, it's just the author's own following, then they're in perfect position to either self-publish or hybrid publish, and just bypass giving such a huge percentage of their royalties to a traditional publisher.
yeah. Which, as I mentioned, I've seen some of my clients do and do very well. As doing that with kind of going the hybrid route. Um, so I'm going to go on a limb here and kind of share my own perspective on what was my perspective on hybrid publishing until I saw good examples of it. I, as a writer, and I'm sure you can relate to this, I'm sure a lot of writers can relate to it, thought that the only way, and I haven't written a book yet, I haven't even tried to write a book yet, but my I plan on writing a book one day, like every writer in the world. And my kind of belief system has been that I quote unquote made it if I land a book deal. Like a book deal is like the ultimate ticket that says, oh, you have done something good and worthy enough that, we want to put it out there into the world. And that really was challenged by seeing clients of mine actually reject book deals and go like the self-publishing, hybrid publishing route. So what I want to know from you is, for any listeners out there who feel like they like quote unquote failed or were rejected by the literary world because they didn't get a book deal and now they're considering alternative options. Do you have any thoughts on that? Any thoughts on kind of like navigating those thought processes?
Yeah, I mean, well, rejection is fuel, right? So, and that's great, and I understand, it still has that like old school like cachet to it, like getting the
Mm.
book deal. But the thing is that it's just for such a like, it's like saying that, oh, if I'm gonna be a gambler, I didn't make it until I win the lottery. And it's like, well, it's just like the thinking is just a little flawed, right?
Yeah.
Because there are so many amazing writers who are getting passed over maybe because they don't have 200,000 Instagram followers, right? Like writerly talent has less and less to do with this sort of equation, right? If you're going to try to write a book that's just purely and bluntly super marketable, then yeah, like traditional publishing can be a good route for you. But the fact is most writers write because they love writing. They write
Yeah.
because they feel like they have something they want to say. Whether that be nonfiction, whether it be memoir, they're telling their own story, whether it be they've just had this sci-fi idea in their head that they just needed to get down in a novel, like they're a poet, whatever. It's like they're writing because they love writing. And the thing is that doesn't have a whole heck of a lot to do with traditional publishing in this day and
Yeah.
age, right? So if you love
Unfortunately.
writing, yeah, if you love writing and you feel like you created something and you really want it to be cared for, it's like you're just going to have such a better experience like taking control over your writing journey and your publishing journey, like by working with a place like Atmosphere or some other reputable firm or self-publishing on your own. It's just going to be such a more validating experience because that you did it on your own terms. You weren't waiting around a decade to have somebody say like, oh, you're good enough, because that the
Mm.
definitions with which they're deciding who's good enough might not necessarily even be aligned with yours.
Did you know that my company, Hustling Writers, books entrepreneurs, and authors on podcasts? We've been doing this for the last 5 years, and we've booked our clients on hundreds of top 1% and top 0.5% podcasts, which has, as a result, led to their books being instant bestsellers and even selling out on Amazon on the day of release. If this is of interest to you and the idea of being interviewed by a name like Adam Grant or Mariana Hewitt sounds really exciting, let me know. Email media@hustlingwriters.com and I'll be in touch to book a discovery call. Yeah, yeah, exactly. So if a writer has decided they want to go the hybrid route, they've weighed up their options and this is what they want to pursue, what do you think that they should take into consideration before choosing a publisher to work with?
Yeah, well, I think it's really just about the clarity of the contract and the deal,
Mm,
right? And that's, like I said, why we make ours, public online, because it guarantees that authors keep their rights to their work, they get a large royalty share, and they have final say over some key aesthetic moves, and it also is very clear cut. And this is probably the most important one of all. Honestly, is the most important one, is what are you getting? Like, what types of
yeah.
meetings are you getting? What type of design are you getting? Like, what distribution are you getting? Like, are these people actually going to be working with? And another really huge one, look at the masthead. Go to
Mm,
the website, see who is on the team. Like, who
mm,
will you actually be working with? Because if it's, a place like a publisher or a hybrid publisher where you can't tell like who's working for them, like who knows, like you might be
yeah.
getting like outsourced to interns in a call center somewhere, like people who aren't going to care about your book, who have worked for the company for like 5 minutes, they might be gone tomorrow, you might lose your editor, like that story you told about the traditional published author. Whereas with us, we've got our team on our website, like 90% of our team has been working with us for multiple years. And
Mm,
these are people who, they have MFAs or PhDs or creative writing backgrounds or design backgrounds. If they're in that, they've worked in book publicity for years. They've been web designers for years. These types of skill sets, and being able to actually see their faces see their names, look them up online. They're real people. That I think really goes a long way. And knowing that you're working with, really reputable people, that's going to be, much better than just, trying to, you know, jump on whatever service might be the cheapest or the
Yeah.
path of least resistance.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't gone that route, but I think that that all makes perfect sense. And what I'm really gleaning from that is take a look at who you're working with and choose the people. Make that kind of a key part of your decision making process. Which I've
Mm-hmm.
seen again with some of my clients, is they like would choose hybrid publishers based on the fact that the marketing team are like experts and have connections to certain media people or something. So I think, yeah, getting to know who you're working with is probably what you're saying. Um, so, Nick, I'm curious to know a little bit about your own literary journey. You've written 4 books. Your most recent one is The Forgotten World. What has your relationship with getting your work out there as a poet been like?
Oh, of course, it's been utter torture. you know, yeah. So I've published 3 books of poetry and 1 book of literary criticism, and in all of the cases, it was grueling. To some extent. Sending it out, getting it rejected. Yeah, just getting it rejected. Like my second book was actually the first one that I wrote, and it had been rejected dozens of times. It had been a finalist to a
Mm,
bunch of different contests, and then I just got so discouraged that I actually just put it in a drawer. I gave up on it,
yeah.
and then just wrote a whole new book, which ultimately became Punchline, which was my first book. And then only after that one came out did I go back and say, okay, let's try to rehabilitate this other one. I like changed it, put a new title on it, like rearranged how it was laid out, all of that, and then finally ended up getting that one out there. And then after that, it was another 6 or 7 years before I published another book of poetry. And I'd written multiple books in that time
Mm,
period, right? But just the thought of going out into that ringer of rejection again, definitely just wasn't very appealing. So
mm,
it's been difficult. And then the book of literary criticism, like that was another one where, I had to go through all these like rounds of proposals with like academic publishers, and then they just take forever and ever and ever to respond to you. And then when they do respond, they might give you like a line, like a sentence. And then ultimately with that, I still had it out for consideration with some academic publishers, but I ended up getting an offer from Blaze Vox Press, which is like a small independent publisher based out of Buffalo, and I was just like, I'm just taking this.
yeah, yeah.
So I was glad to have that, glad to have the book out there. But yeah, like any writer,
Yeah.
has taken their licks, I think.
How did you stay resilient in the face of all those rejections and actually get your writing out there? Because I think there's probably so many writers who never get their work out there, never sees the light of day.
Yeah, well, definitely like perseverance is a big part of it. And I think like
Mm,
now it is really great that there are like self-publishing and hybrid publishing are options,
mm,
because they do mean that you don't have to give up on your project. There are alternatives. That's different than how it was,
mm,
even like, 10, 15 years ago, where like those were still very much seen as being like, oh, like you sort of gave up on your work kind of viewpoints. And now that's not the case anymore. So please don't give up on your work. Sometimes you need to let it sit for a while. Sometimes you need to think it through. That's great. Like you always want to, be thoughtful in your decisions, but don't give up on it. It's just because you haven't found the right publisher, the right editor yet, doesn't mean they're not out there. They are out there.
mm.
You just haven't found the right one.
I think there's great wisdom in also letting it sit and coming back to it. Because I think that when it's very fresh, you're probably not the most objective viewer of the writing. Whereas you're probably leaving your book in your drawer for a few years. You probably came at it with a completely different set of eyes and approach to getting that book edited and ready for the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's, a lot of time, a little bit of perspective helps. Like, I think a
Mm.
writer's never going to be able to be like fully objective about their own work, like even if it's been years, but it
Which is
does
why
get
editors are
easier.
important, right?
Yeah, which is why editors are important. Every once in a while, we'll end up with some, author contact us and they're like, "Oh, I could just like skip the editorial stage. I don't need that. I like already know." And it's like, no, I'm pretty sure, like that every, like T.S. Eliot needed an editor, like every great writer through history has like benefited from editors because, it's just impossible to see your work clearly without one.
And I mean, many great writers take it a step further and go through like countless beta readers, like before even reaching that editing stage, because
Mm-hmm.
the human brain has so many blind spots. There's so many things we can be missing.
Yeah, and also another key thing, sort of on the counter of that, is don't listen to everyone,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Because there are always, nothing ventured, nothing gained. Like
Mm.
fortune favors the bold. Like all of these ideas, it's like if you are putting yourself out there, if you're doing something interesting, like not everybody's gonna like it. So it's less about pleasing everybody and more about like pleasing your exact
Yeah.
audience and ignoring everybody else.
I'm curious to know because you probably like have a lot of experience with this. Is how do you strike that balance? Because there's on the one hand like major blind spots that you could have as an author, which I'm sure many of your authors have, where they're just not hitting the mark and the book's just not it's not living up to its potential, versus them holding conviction of like this is an idea I want to keep and it's very central to the book. Navigating that as an author, where like what is bad and should be scrapped, kill your darlings, and should be reworked, versus what is good and should stay. How can an author discern between like those things, I guess, when they're getting feedback?
Yeah, I mean it's always going to be a balancing act,
Mm,
right? And I think if you've got to like if you're going to go into a writing workshop, for example, it's like you don't want to listen to everybody in the workshop. You want to listen to
mm.
the one person who gets you,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And that's sort of the same thing. And I always think that you shouldn't necessarily try to write to a particular audience. You should just try to be better at the skill set that you have as a writer. If you just hone your own craft and work on your craft and work and work and work on getting better at your craft, at reading things that you admire, modeling after them, taking efforts to improve your technique. If you're doing those steps over time, you're going to have an audience. Like the
Mm,
audience
mm.
is going to exist, right? You can't necessarily try to write towards them. It's almost like they sort of emerge out of the woodwork once you become, sufficiently expert at your own style, because
Mm,
you're not the only person who would find that style appealing.
mm.
So I think it's odd in that
Yeah.
way, right? That the audience just they'll find you,
Mm.
rather than you needing necessarily to try to change your style to match them. You just need to be you really really well, and there will be others who like who that is.
Yeah, I love that so much. So when you're speaking about this, is this writing in a way that it's being shared publicly continually so that that audience can find you? What is this process where the audience is finding you, or is it just honing your craft and so that when the book goes out in the world, the audience will find you?
I think it's a little bit of both, right? And
Mm,
it takes time. A lot of times authors want their first book to be a big hit, right? But you
mm.
got to build audience over time.
Yeah.
Like people now, I'll hear from somebody and they're like, "Oh, I really, liked this book of yours that I read, but I wrote it like 7 years ago."
Mm.
Whereas like back then, I might have been like, "Oh, I wish I had another reader," and it just took time,
Yeah.
to like find that audience. And then when you find somebody and they're like they are into what you're doing, then they might go back and they find your other books and then they read those, and then it sort of grows organically over time. uh, And that's just the way it is with writing. There's not going to be, something, especially in literature and like fiction and
Yeah.
poetry, like everything is nuanced, everything is idiosyncratic to some extent.
So, what comes to my mind, because I agree with everything you're saying, and it's something that I practice in the sense of like marketing myself, is, like I just need to put the post out there, put it in the world. It like doesn't matter if it just gets a lot of engagement. And over time, you kind of see that compounding effect of, growing an audience and like kind of compounding gains of what's happening by putting yourself out there. But when it comes to, and again, I haven't written a book, but it's probably a reason why, is when it comes to doing something like writing a book, I think that that would be the area I would have the most perfectionist tendencies towards out of everything, like ever, because I identify as a writer more strongly than I identify as anything else. So, even an entrepreneur, like my business means so much to me, but I identify as a writer first. It's the thing that I identified as when I was 7 years old and continue to throughout my adulthood. So the thought of writing a book and that book going out in the world and that book bombing and no one reading that book is like the ego dying, and like I don't think I'm ready for that. So I wonder if this is something that authors have, like where they're just so scared that this book is not going to perform in a way that they kind of are more scared of this than anything else not going right in their life, if that makes sense, because they are too entwined with their identity as a writer.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I feel like a big part of what we do at Atmosphere is actually a bit of sort of therapy on that, because it is scary.
Mm.
Publishing a book is scary. Getting it out there, you don't know how people are going to react. Like everybody wants to be loved. Everyone's going to be like nervous about the haters, and the thing is the more successful your book is, the more haters you're going to have,
Yeah.
so it's like, it's definitely like a devil's bargain there. You're like,
Mm.
oh, I want everybody to know about my book, and be like, well, get ready. Like you're gonna have people who don't like it, and like that's great, that's fine. Somebody just picks up your book, they flip through it and they put it down. You're like, oh, why didn't you like my book? It's like, well, that just wasn't the right reader.
Mm.
It's fine.
Mm. Mm.
um but yeah, so the perfectionist thing is a huge issue. We really like try to coach people towards letting go. They've got to be sort of like the empty nest writer who's like children like left the nest, and now they're like at home alone and they don't know what to do with themselves anymore, and they're worried about what their children are going to do out there in the world. It is a scary thing. And we try
Mm.
to coach people through that, make them more at ease about it. And also just always remember that a book is it is a historical document. Like
Yeah.
every book is a time capsule. So if you write a book and it comes out and you're like years later, you're like, I wish I'd done this differently, or I didn't really like this book. And then that just means you got to write another one.
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know,
Different
and
perspectives.
yeah, and you'll become a different person. Like I look back at the one that I published in 2012. That's not me anymore. That was
Mm.
written by a different person. I even look at The Forgotten World, which came out, I think, in 2021. And yeah, different person, because
Yeah.
I wrote a lot of that between like, 2015 to like 2020. And it's like, that was a long time ago, so and it's always going to be like that. So just sort of cutting the cord, realizing that yes, it is just a document of history, and then you will continue creating new history from there. I think is definitely
Yeah.
a chasm people need to cross.
The chasm you need to cross. I love that so much. Such a great, apt metaphor and a document of a history. And I think, something that I look at when I look at my decisions is, will I regret not doing this thing more than this thing not working out? So I think as an author, as an aspiring author, if you have not written that book, this is how I would look at it. Is I would be like, will I regret not writing the book more than writing the book and the book not being successful? And it's always the former. Like I would much rather know that the book wasn't successful than always have that question of like, what if I did like went and did that thing that I always wanted to do. Um, so yeah. Anyway, can you talk to me a little bit about your latest book? So I know that you explore a bunch of themes. It's a poetry. It's a collection of poems. Explores topics kind of around the world. Love, colonialism, whiteness. Did the poems come first or did the themes come first? It's just a question I'm curious about. I'll jump into.
Yeah, yeah. So the Forgotten World is basically it's a book. It sort of traveling a lot. So when I wrote most of the book, not in the United States, so I was around in a lot of other different countries. Sort of like in oftentimes alone, and being adrift in the world in a sense, and trying to make sense of that, trying to make sense of culture, trying to make sense of being an American in the world and all the ramifications and moral quandaries that provides. So the book is, in a sense, sort of a travelogue, like going geographically around the world to these different places and sort of commenting on it. Ultimately, then in the final part, to come back to the United States, which at the time was sort of being, roiled by, the Trump administration, by the early stage pandemic, by the George Floyd murder, like these sort of things, and then trying to reconcile like the complex issue of America and Americanness in the global context. And it's called The Forgotten World because the book came out during the pandemic, at a time where it's like, wow, there is a lot of other world out there, but we're all, of course, like it is in a state of having been forgotten because we are incapable of accessing it.
Yeah. And I like that you're writing about it from the other side because I'm not American, but I talk to Americans all the time. All my clients are American. And I'm South African. I'm living in the Middle East right now. Like you, I've traveled a fair bit and spent time in other places. And America is so central to the psyche of people in other parts of the world. When George Floyd and Black Lives Matter was happening in 2020, that was a central part of discussions in South Africa. People sometimes our clients ask me like, how do you work with Americans, how do you keep up to date? And I'm like, I don't think you understand, like your news is our news, like it is very much like America kind of shapes culture. But there is a kind of, from the other side, there's this I don't know what the wording would be, you feel there's this distinct feeling of loneliness slash gaslighting. I don't know how to describe it, but when things go wrong in other parts of the world, when global catastrophes happen, genocides happen, whatever is happening, and you see Americans who are very vocal about social issues as it pertains to America not say anything, and it's like this whole other world doesn't exist beyond America. um, and I mean, I've had very smart clients be surprised that it's summer in South Africa when it's winter in America, because like the concept of the global South having opposite climates is surprising. So I'm very curious, like kind of your journey towards reconciling that. I know it doesn't relate too much to rejection, but it's just
Yeah,
something.
well, I mean, it's definitely a huge part of it because America is so central, and that is almost in the book sort of a sense of shame,
Mm,
because of that. It's like if you're an American traveling around the world, it's like, oh, we already are like pumping our culture like into everyone's ears, like everywhere they go. It's like being like so like almost borderline irritated being in a place like, Egypt or Cambodia, and the person driving the car like turns the radio on and it's playing like Taylor Swift or something. It's just like, oh gosh, you can't escape Americanness, and then of course a big part of the book is helping, trying to remind people that there is another world, that there are other people out there, that it's not just like Americans navel gazing at Americanness, right? That there is there are other cultures and that they're not scary.
mm,
There's a lot of
mm.
like because America is just huge and a lot of people don't get out of it sufficiently, or
Mm.
if they do get out of it, they're just like going to Europe,
Yeah.
which is not as, different as it probably needs to be to actually like show them the reality and the richness of experiences in places like, Africa, Asia, South America, et cetera,
Mm.
where there are people living their lives and they're like good, honest people, with different cultures that maybe a lot of Americans are sort of oblivious to.
So you've mentioned, and I think you mentioned this in one of our emails, that creators can take charge of their creative destinies. What do you mean by this?
Yeah, so I just mean, if you are, an author, if you're a writer, if you're, wanting to get your book out, you don't need to wait around. Like you
Mm.
can take steps today to like have the sort of publishing experience that you want. So, with Atmosphere Press, like I recommend, just check us out, go to atmospherepress.com. You can submit a manuscript on there. We have free book giveaways on there. We run a free author interview series for writers at all stages of their, project completion. We even have a publishing quiz on there, where you can take this quiz and just answer questions about your personal vision on, your book cover, how you view marketing, how you view, or how complete your work is, other sort of, questions just about the publishing experience. And then we'll send you advice based on, the answers that you gave to the quiz, whether that means, hey, you should do self-publishing, or hey, you should seek an agent, or hey, you might actually be a good fit for Atmosphere. So one of the big things about us is that we want to be supportive of all writers and give
Mm.
resources to all writers, regardless of whether they ultimately end up working with us. So that's the type of thing where, you don't need to, wait around, you know,
Mm.
hoping that somebody is going to knight you.
Yeah.
You can go out there and you can start taking some steps to, make a difference for yourself as a writer now.
I love that so much. And I think this is not related to writing, it's related to entrepreneurship, because we're both here as both those sorts of people. I think that one of the keys to running a sustainable business that where either you have clients who you retain, which obviously book publishing, maybe they come back to you for the next book,
Mm-hmm.
or you get referrals, is being able to tell a client when they're not a fit, which it sounds like you do through those quizzes.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that I believe in very much. Is like, I want to tell someone when I don't think they'll benefit from my services, because ultimately it breeds trust. It means that the people that I do work with are right for me and for the business, and they stick around for longer. So yeah, I love that you included that. So, Nick, I just want to thank you so much for being a fantastic guest on this show. For listeners listening, you can order a copy of Nick's books on Amazon. They're all there. I'll include a link to the show notes. I'm also going to be giving away a copy of The Forgotten World to a listener who subscribes and reviews the show. You just need to email me screenshots at media@hustlingwriters.com. Thank you again, Nick.
Thank you.
This was My Rejection Story, hosted by me, Alice Draper.